butterfly in the sky. I can go twice as high. Take a look, it's in a book, it's reading a rainbow. I can go anywhere. It's friends to know and ways to grow, it's reading rainbow. I can be anything. Take a look, it's in a book, it's reading rainbow. Reading rainbow, reading rainbow, reading rainbow.
Welcome back to Book 3, Chapter 2, Continued. When we left off, Winston had found himself in the Ministry of Love, and O'Brien has wheeled him into a room, also known as Room 101. And Winston is unsure of where he is. He has been drugged multiple times. He's been beaten multiple times and in multiple ways. Winston's kind of in bad shape. And at this point, he's kind of come to, and we last discussed about he had a moment in time where he felt as though he heard O'Brien whisper to him that he will make him perfect. And so now we find Winston waking up in Room 101. And we'll start right at PDF page 308. I told you, said O'Brien, that if we met again, it would be here. Yes, said Winston. Without any warning except a slight movement of O'Brien's hand, a wave of pain flooded his body. Do you guys remember when Winston talks about where he's laying? He's laying on like a gurney and he's completely strapped down and there's a dial next to his head. So the wave of pain flooded his body. It was a frightening pain because he could not see what was happening, and he had the feeling that some mortal injury was being done to him. He did not know whether the thing was really happening or whether the effect was electrically produced, but his body was being wrenched out of shape. The joints were being slowly torn apart, and although the pain had brought the sweat out of his forehead, the worst of all was the fear that his backbone was about to snap. He set his teeth and breathed hard through his nose, trying to keep silent as long as possible. So your first question asks you, when Winston finally comes to and realizes that O'Brien's with him, O'Brien says, I told you that if we met again, it would be here. So where is here? In the place where there is no darkness, a.k.a. the Ministry of Love, a.k.a. Room 101. And then what's happening to Winston when O'Brien turns the dial? Basically, in the simplest terms, he's being shocked. He's being electrically shocked. And to Winston, it feels as though his backbone's about to break. So it's really painful. You're afraid, said O'Brien, watching his face, that in another moment something's going to break. Your special fear is that it will be your backbone. You have a vivid mental picture of the vertebrae snapping apart and the spinal fluid dripping out of them. That's what you're thinking, is it not, Winston? Winston did not answer. O'Brien drew back the lever on the dial, and the wave of pain receded almost as quickly as it had come. That was 40, said O'Brien. You can see that the numbers on the dial run up to 100. Will you please remember throughout our conversation that I have it in my power to inflict pain on you at any moment and to whatever decree I choose? If you tell me any lies or attempt to prevaricate in any way or even fall below your usual level of intelligence, you will cry out in pain instantly. Do you understand that? Yes, said Winston. O'Brien's manner became less severe. He rested his spectacles thoughtfully and took a place or two up and down. When he spoke, his voice was gentle and patient. He had the air of a doctor, a teacher, even a priest, anxious to explain and persuade rather than to punish. I'm taking trouble with you, Winston, he said, because you are worth trouble. You know perfectly well what is the matter with you. You've known it for years, though you have fought against the knowledge. You are mentally deranged. You suffer from a defective memory. You are unable to remember real events, and you persuade yourself that you remember other events which never happened. Fortunately, it's curable. You've never cured yourself of it because you did not choose to. There was a small effort of will that you were not ready to make. Even now, I am well aware, you are clinging to your disease under the impression that it is virtue. Now we will take an example. At this moment, which power is Oceania at war with? When I was arrested, Oceania was at war with East Asia. With East Asia? Good. And Oceania has always been at war with East Asia, has it not? Winston drew in his breath. He opened his mouth to speak and then did not speak. He could not take his eyes away from the dial. The truth, please, Winston. Your truth. Tell me what you think you remember. Now I'm going to pause there because at this point, I'm pretty sure you can tell what's happening, right? Intense brainwashing. So Winston knows that Oceania has not been at war with Eastasia the whole time. He knows it. He knows it to be a complete and utter fact. And yet, here's a man who Winston totally looks up to and is going to try and convince him the opposite, I'm certain. So, now that they've had this, the conversation continues on, but Winston starts to wonder, is what he remembers the real events, or is what O'Brien telling him, are those the real events? I remember that until only a week before I was arrested, we were not at war with Eastasia at all. We were in alliance with them, the war against Eurasia. That had lasted 4 years. Before that, O'Brien stopped him with a movement of the hand. Another example, he said. Some years ago, you had a very serious delusion indeed. You believed that three one-time party members named Jones, Aronson, and Rutherford, men who were executed for treachery and sabotage after making the fullest possible confession, were not guilty of the crimes they were charged with. You believed that you had seen unmistakable documentary evidence proving that their confessions were false. There was a certain photograph about which you had a hallucination. You believed that you had actually held it in your hands. It was a photograph, something like this. And so you guys remember, years prior to this, Winston retelling Julia about this photo that he had found that proved that those three men who died after being a part of the Brotherhood, and they were found in the Nut Tree Cafe. Remember the guys that were crying because that song played and they knew they were about to die? They'd been captured, and they'd been forced to admit to all these crimes that they didn't actually do, and then they were let go, and then they were hanging out in the cafe, and then they hear the song and they know they're going to die. So all that has already happened, and Winston is like, I saw the photo. He's the one who burned it. He is the one who held that photo in his hand. The unmistakable evidence that those three men were innocent, he held in his hand and he let it go. He burned it. And then he told Julia, if I could go back in time, I would have saved that photo because it would have proved that the party had been lying. And so now O'Brien brings that up, and he said, and it looked like this. An oblong slip of newspaper had appeared between O'Brien's fingers. For perhaps 5 seconds, it was within angle of Winston's vision. It was a photograph, and there was no question of its identity. It was the photograph. It was another copy of the photograph of Jones, Aronson, and Rutherford at the party function in New York, which he had chanced upon 11 years ago and promptly destroyed. For only an instant, it was before his eyes, and then it was out of sight again. But he had seen it. Unquestionably, he had seen it. He made a desperate, agonizing effort to wrench the top half of his body free. It was impossible to move so much so as a centimeter in any direction, and for the moment, he had even forgotten the dial. All he wanted was to hold the photograph in his fingers again, or at least to see it. It exists, he cried. No, said O'Brien. He stepped across the room. There was a memory hole in the opposite wall. O'Brien lifted the grating. Unseen, the frail slip of paper was whirling away on the current of warm air, and it was vanishing in a flash of flame. O'Brien turned away from the wall. Ashes, he said. Not even identifiable ashes. Dust. It does not exist. It never existed. But it did exist. It does exist. It exists in memory. I remember it. You remember it. I do not remember it, said O'Brien. Winston's heart sank. That was doublethink. He had a feeling of deadly helplessness. If he could have been certain that O'Brien was lying, it would not have seemed the matter. But it was perfectly possible that O'Brien had really forgotten the photograph, and if so, then already he would have forgotten his denial of remembering it and forgotten the act of forgetting. How could one be sure that it was simply trickery? Perhaps that lunatic dislocation in the mind could really happen. That was the thought that defeated him. I love that part. So Winston is finally seeing O'Brien for who he really is in that moment, because O'Brien is holding that piece of evidence, throws it into the memory hole, burns it to dust, and then says it never existed. And Winston just saw it. And O'Brien says, well, I already forgot I saw it. And now Winston's like, did he really forget that he saw it? Is he really going crazy? Am I going crazy? So, your questions are asking, what did he do with the piece of paper? Obviously, the evidence, the photograph, he throws into the memory hole and turns it to dust. After O'Brien does what he does with the evidence, he convinces Winston that it never existed and that it doesn't remember it. So what does Winston say this is an example of? He clearly claims this is doublethink. He believes that O'Brien is trying to confuddle him and confuse him and mix him up. And so that's what exactly the party members do to their to the people. They try and convince them, and they try and confuse them, and they give them different facts, and then they get all mixed up, and then they don't know what to believe, so they just trust. Okay, and then we'll continue. Oh, no. Okay, so Winston's beginning to realize what's going on here and states that, quote, perhaps that lunatic dislocation in the mind could really happen, and that was the thought that defeated him. So the thought that O'Brien could really have seen that piece of paper, burned it in the memory hole, and then instantly have forgotten it, Winston is wondering, that's a lunatic dislocation of the mind. His mind and brain and heart are totally dislocated. They're not connected anymore. If he's able to do something physically and then forget it instantly, and so Winston feels defeated that is actually a possibility, that this government could really do that to somebody, and now he's feeling just defeated. O'Brien was looking down at him speculatively. More than ever, he had the air of a teacher taking pains with a wayward but promising child. There is a party slogan, dealing with the control of the past, he said. Repeat it, if you please. Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past, repeated Winston obediently. Who controls the present controls the past, said O'Brien, nodding his head with slow approval. Is it your opinion, Winston, that the past has real existence? Again, the feeling of helplessness descended upon Winston. His eyes flitted toward the dial. He not only did not know whether yes or no was the answer that would save him from pain, he did not even know which answer he believed to be the true one. So O'Brien is asking, do you think that the past has real existence? If you were to question that yourself, did your childhood really exist? Did your childhood actually happen? And Winston doesn't know what the answer is that's going to cause him the least amount of pain, and he also just doesn't know what he believes on that. O'Brien smiled faintly. You are no metaphysician, Winston, he said. Until this moment, you had never considered what it meant by existence. I will put it more precisely. Does the past exist concretely in space? Is there somewhere or other place a world of solid objects where the past is still happening? No. Then where does the past exist, if at all? In records. It's written down. In records and in the mind, in human memories. In memory. Very well then. We, the party, control all records, and we control all memories. Then we control the past, do we not? But how can you stop people remembering things? Cried Winston, again momentarily forgetting the dial. It's involuntary. It's outside oneself. How can you control memory? You have not controlled mine. O'Brien's manner grew stern again, and he laid his hand on the dial. On the contrary, he said, you have not controlled it. That's what's brought you here. You are here because you have failed in humility and self-discipline. You would not make the act of submission, which is the price of sanity. You preferred to be a lunatic, a minority of one. Only the disciplined mind can see reality, Winston. You believe that reality is something objective, external, existing in its own right. You also believe that the nature of reality is self-evident. When you delude yourself into thinking that you see something, you assume that everyone else sees the same thing as you. But I tell you, Winston, that reality is not external. Reality exists in the human mind and nowhere else. Not in the individual mind, which can make mistakes, and in any case soon perishes. Only in the mind of the party, which is collective and immortal. Whatever the party holds to be the truth is the truth. It is impossible to see reality except by looking through the eyes of the party. That's the fact that you have gotten to relearn, Winston. It needs an act of self-destruction, an effort of the will. You must humble yourself before you can become sane. Whoa. Oof. So Winston grows extremely upset because he feels like he remembers everything in his past, and how is that not reality to him? Is that not what makes a human being? Is that not what makes an individual an individual? Is their own experiences and their own perception? So without that, then, O'Brien believes that Winston should just forget all that and only think about what the party believes and what the party sees. And then when he does that, then he will be sane. Because to rely on his own independent feelings and thoughts is being insane. He paused for a few moments, as though to allow what he had been saying to sink in. Do you remember, he went on, writing in your diary, freedom is the freedom to say that 2 + 2 make 4? Yes, said Winston. O'Brien held up his left hand, its back toward Winston, with the thumb hiding and the 4 fingers extended. How many fingers am I holding up, Winston? 4. And if the party says that it's not 4 but 5, then how many? 4. The word ended in a gasp of pain. The needle of the dial had shot up to 55. The sweat had sprung out all over Winston's body, and the air tore into his lungs and issued again in deep groans, which even by clenching his teeth could not stop. O'Brien watched him, the 4 fingers still extended. He drew back the lever. This time the pain was only slightly eased. How many fingers, Winston? 4. The needle went up to 60. How many fingers, Winston? 4! 4! What else can I say? It's 4! The needle must have been risen again, but he did not look at it. The heavy, stern face and the 4 fingers filled his vision. The fingers stood up before his eyes like pillars, enormous, blurry, and seeming to vibrate, but unmistakably 4. How many fingers, Winston? 4! Stop it! Stop it! How can you go on? 4! 4! How many fingers, Winston? 5! 5! 5! No, Winston, that is no use. You are lying. You still think there are 4. How many fingers, please? 4! 5! 4! Anything you like. Only stop it. Stop the pain. Abruptly, he was sitting up, with O'Brien's arm round his shoulders. He had perhaps lost consciousness for a few seconds. The bonds that held his body down were loosened. He felt very cold. He was shaking uncontrollably. His teeth were chattering, the tears were rolling down his cheeks, and for a moment he clung to O'Brien like a baby, curiously comforted by the heavy arm round his shoulders. He had the feeling that O'Brien was his protector, that the pain was something that came from outside, from some other source, and that it was O'Brien who would save him from it. "You're a slow learner, Winston," said O'Brien gently. "How can I help it?" he blubbered. "How can I help seeing what's in front of my eyes? 2 and 2 are 4. Sometimes, Winston, sometimes they are 5. Sometimes they're 3. Sometimes they're all of them at once. You must try harder. It's not easy to become sane." He laid Winston down on the bed. The grip on his limbs tightened again, but the pain had ebbed away and the trembling had stopped, leaving him merely weak and cold. O'Brien motioned with his head to the man in the white coat, who had stood immobile throughout the proceedings. The man in the white coat bent down and looked closely into Winston's eyes, felt his pulse, laid an ear against his chest, tapped here and then he nodded to O'Brien. "Again," said O'Brien. The pain flowed into Winston's body. The needle must be at 70, 75. He'd shut his eyes this time. He knew that the fingers were still there and still 4. All that mattered was somehow to stay alive until the spasm was over. He had ceased to notice whether he was crying out or not. The pain lessened again, and he opened his eyes. O'Brien had drawn back the lever. So basically, O'Brien is screaming in his face with these 4 fingers, asking him how many fingers there are, and Winston isn't going to say any number but 4 because he sees 4. And every time he says 4, he gets shocked more and more and more until there's a point where he loses consciousness. O'Brien has to turn off the shocking system. A doctor comes in to check Winston, says, "Oh, he's still good." And so then O'Brien just turns it back on him and shocks him again. "How many fingers, Winston?" 4. I suppose there are 4. I would see 5 if I could. I'm trying to see 5. Which do you wish? To persuade me that you see 5, or that you really see them? Really to see them. Again, said O'Brien. Perhaps the needle was at 80, 90. Winston can only intermittently remember why the pain was happening. Behind his screwed-up eyelids, a forest of fingers seemed to be moving in a sort of dance, weaving in and out, disappearing behind one another and reappearing again. He was trying to count them. He could not remember why. He knew only that it was impossible to count them, and that this was somehow due to the mysterious identity between 5 and 4. The pain died down again. When he opened his eyes, it was to find that he was still seeing the same thing. Innumerable fingers, like moving trees, were still streaming past in either direction, crossing and recrossing. He shut his eyes again. "How many fingers am I holding up, Winston?" "I don't know. I don't know. You'll kill me if you do that again. 4, 5, 6, in all honesty, I don't know." "Better," said O'Brien. A needle slid into Winston's arm, and almost in the same instant, a blissful, healing warmth spread all through his body. And we'll pause there. So, O'Brien is super messed up and really just wants to help Winston, quote, get sane, which would mean that Winston has to be insane in order to follow this rule of sanity. So, poor Winston.